Hello everyone. I just want to let everybody know that is listening to this video. The information that I'm going to discuss will most likely change the entire state of North Carolina, if not the entire country, when it comes to domestic violence victims, survivors, and their children post-separation. I might as well just go ahead and jump in. And like I said, I am going to focus on the state of North Carolina, although it is going to be very clear that these numbers and these statistics and things like this should be looked into as a whole, collectively, globally, internationally, and nationally, as far as when we are looking at the numbers and the funding and the recognition and the implementation of the money that is coming in. I first want to start with saying that the state of North Carolina, as well as most other states in the United States, receive funding. They receive funding for things like funding child victims of abuse and neglect, housing for domestic violence survivors, therapy services, legal assistance, housing, like I said, Crime Victims Service Committee funding, the VOCA Act, that's the Victims of Crime Act, and the Violence Against Women Act. Those are basically streams of federal funding that goes in for judicial training, the courts, prosecuting offenders, law enforcement, for grants improving the criminal justice response to violence against women and children. And as I'm sure most of you all know, sorry, can't talk today. As I'm sure most of you all are aware, nationally and internationally, homicides are on the rise, as well as nationally, an uptick of domestic violence victims and their children, or an abuser and a child, either murder, suicide, or killing the woman and child. Because why? Because she left, right? She left. And that's the common denominator here. As far as the homicides go, when it comes to domestic violence. When a woman is ready to leave, that's when murders occur. When she is ending the relationship, that's when these killings are occurring, that you see all of these beautiful children, these beautiful women being snuffed out because she left. In North Carolina, according to the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, who, and I'll explain a little bit about the funding for the North Carolina Department of Public Safety. The Governor's Crime Commission actually doles out the funding once whatever is applicable gets approved. The Governor's Commission on Crime, let's just get to this page here. Sorry, guys. Okay, so the Governor's Crime Commission approves grants throughout the enterprise management system of grants, and specifically for the North Carolina Department of Public Safety for things like crime victim services, criminal justice improvement, the Office of Violence Against Women grants, Department of Justice grants, COPS, law enforcement grants, Office of Judicial improvement. Also block grants for each of the counties to be divided up. And within the Governor's Crime Commission, there are 44 members, and they determine the criteria established to obtain funding. So these streams of funding, the Burn JAG Recovery Act award is $40 to $50 million annually, and that was the number back in 2008. So hundreds of millions of dollars come into the state of North Carolina each year from the Violence Against Women Act, the Department of Justice, Office of Violence Against Women, and that's based on the JAG award for the meeting of certain criteria for the Burn Justice Assistance Grants for things like child victims of abuse and neglect, domestic violence survivors of abuse and sexual assault, and like I mentioned before, housing for survivors, legal assistance. What is actually being reported to the United States government out of the state of North Carolina does not correspond with the facts. And I'm going to highlight that in the next few minutes. Okay. So in 2002, there were 79 domestic violence homicides in the state of North Carolina. 54 of those homicide victims were killed by their ex-boyfriend or their estranged husband. More than half of these victims, survivors they were leaving, had children. Fast forward to 2020. North Carolina only has 7 domestic violence homicides, and the lowest incidences of child abuse when they're coinciding with the rest of the United States. In specific counties, the substantiation based on when we mentioned the previous domestic violence homicide rate back in 2002, on an average of 2,500 to 3,000 abuse reports for children, for child abuse to CPS, around 800 to 900 were being substantiated. So, it was a pretty good number. So 800 or 900 out of 2,000 or 3,000. Fast forward to 2018 and 2020, we've got numbers like 5,500 investigations, 300 being substantiated. Now, that also gives the ability to meet the criteria for these grants and this funding to say, we're getting all of this money to implement all of these systems. Our numbers must be improving. All of the funding and grant programs must have done their job, right? Wrong. North Carolina DPS statistics. In 2008, the domestic violence homicides within the relationship of the victim and the perpetrator. These numbers didn't appear accurate to me, and that's where I began, because I knew if the child abuse statistics were showing in these years this kind of decline in reporting and things within relation to the family custody and family court matters, the domestic violence numbers had to be correlating. So the numbers didn't appear accurate to me, and it was obvious that they were minimizing post-separation relationships and the fact that the perpetrator and the victim had a child in common to me. So they also greatly exaggerated the lack of domestic violence protective orders filed by the victim. And like I said before, the governor's commission for crime decides where the hundreds of millions are going to go. So if we're saying that these women were not getting protective orders, these victims, when I can go back to, and this is where the reporting really stops. 2001, 2002 is when we stopped getting realistic numbers, because back in 2002, out of 186 domestic violence protective orders, 90% were asking the judge to order that the abuser not interfere in the custody of the child, or asking for custody. When we fast forward to the numbers that are only now reflected by the NCDPS and other places, in addition to the correlation of the establishment of places like the Children's Law Center and the Guilford County Family Justice Center, it's apparent that these people got together, saw a way to capitalize upon certain things, and came up with a plan to do it by concealing what I will get to here in a few minutes. So basically what I'm trying to establish is 90% of women that are actually going to get the protective orders, not the girls that her boyfriend's hitting her, because she's not going to get these protective orders generally. The woman that left the abuser and has children is trying to go get protective orders. In the statistics for NCDPS, that's not being reflected, however, and I have proof that it is being misrepresented and facts are being omitted and misstatements and misrepresentations are being replaced into, as well as the numbers. Let's start in 2002, 79, as I mentioned this before, and I kind of got off of this kind of focus. In 2002, in North Carolina, there were 79 homicides due to domestic violence. 54 of the victims were murdered by their estranged husband, meaning she was leaving, it was over, or her ex-boyfriend, have a child in common. Okay? By 2005, the reporting of that number had gone from 72 domestic violence murders and only 15. Now, the year prior it was 54 that had left a man and been murdered. The next year, 40 less women had been murdered by the man that she hadn't apparently been leaving, according to these statistics about the relationships between the perpetrator and the victim. So around between 2003 and 2005, these numbers, the reporting of these numbers, meaning the relationship between the deceased victim and the perpetrator, were not being properly reported. Let's fast forward to 2021 or 2020, because 2021 isn't over. In 2020, there were only 7 deaths, 7 murders as a result of domestic violence reported in the state of North Carolina. Well, I did a little digging and I looked into news stories. That is definitely not the number. And the most alarming part of this is the numbers of, let's see here. So I started looking into the overall homicides in North Carolina beginning in 2001, because that's when the public reporting began online in the database. I located an option to see the numbers and how they coincide with how the victim knew the perpetrator. There were columns for ex-husband, husband, boyfriend, friend, acquaintance, neighbor, employer, employee, family ties, friend of family, stranger. However, there was no option for ex-boyfriend, estranged husband, child in common, or that she had left the relationship. The largest overall yearly growth in a column was unknown, other known to the victim, acquaintance, or other family. Now, when I say unknown, I'm talking 700 and 800 in 2016. So either we have 700 or 800 unsolved murders in the state of North Carolina a year, or we are misstating facts, and we definitely are, because I did a little bit more digging. Other known to the victim, 37. And that was the largest. These are the largest columns out of all of the listed columns. Acquaintance, 113. Other family, 26. The other columns are like the girlfriend and the girlfriend and the boyfriend and the ex-husband, way lower than these numbers. So, doesn't seem like it's any domestic violence, right? Okay, then. And so I did a little bit more digging. And I looked into there being, obviously there's a hidden category happening. Because if we were to report, and also it appears as though there is a hidden category or misstated for daughters and sons. Because children are being murdered at an alarming rate when it comes to these domestic violence post-separation homicides that are being hidden in the state of North Carolina and capitalized upon in the following ways. So the North Carolina domestic violence, it's NCADV. They show that these victims, how the victims actually knew their killers, but they stopped at a certain year, and it coincides with NCDPS's reporting of the victims. And I want anyone that's watching this to consider the weekly news stories that they are seeing of a woman and a child killed by the child's father. It's because she left. That's why. And when you look at the statistics versus the reports, you see that they're lies. So in the North Carolina, the NCADV numbers, and I mentioned that before, how the victims knew their perpetrators for domestic violence homicides. Approximately 80% of these victims had left the perpetrator in a romantic relationship. So it was a post-separation relationship, and either their children were murdered and the perpetrator committed suicide, or the mother and the children were murdered. However, this is not being reported in the state reports. And just going through, seeing a couple of news stories. North Carolina, women killed by her ex with children in common or not. Fayetteville, Raleigh, Alexander County, Kingston County, another Raleigh, and that's just all in the past 3 years. So they aren't being reported, because the statistics on the NCDPS site states that the lowest common factor between the perpetrators and these domestic violence homicides are the ones that have children in common. That's an absolute lie. And all you have to do is look at the news stories. So basically, the family court system are creating conflict. They're funding the court, funding the district attorney, funding DSS. They're making this huge profit. They're hiding child abuse. They're funding the NCDPS, making more of a profit. They're denying that domestic violence is happening within the confines of family court, where statistics, international and national statistics, show that when a woman leaves an abusive relationship, when she leaves an abuser, the incidence of domestic violence, in addition to child abuse, increase exponentially to where it's deadly, and the lethality level is, there's no way you can ignore it. In this case, we are, and I say we, the state of North Carolina, Forsyth County specifically, but I will say that there are a few more counties that I will be mentioning that are notable within the state of North Carolina, which is the only state I've really done any kind of statistical study on. By denying that domestic violence happens within the confines of custody court, family court, and not giving protective orders to these mothers and forcing them to co-parent with the man that abused her and that she barely escaped from, that she knows is abusing her child and is abusing the system when it comes to the entire process. If we are denying that this domestic violence happens, and like in the news story show, we're denying protective orders to women with custody orders, they're dying. And in the state of North Carolina, that has a very high percentage of domestic violence survivors that are dying, that are being murdered at the hands of her abuser post-separation, and her children are dying too. But the state of North Carolina is not reporting it. They're reporting them by changing the title or the name of the relationship between the deceased victim and the perpetrator. They're getting funding for investigating, for prosecuting in the DA's office, for doing these things for these child victims. And I'm talking hundreds of millions of dollars every single year in the state of North Carolina for victims, for legal assistance, for these child victims who have, barely survived as well. However, their abuse is not being substantiated specifically and intentionally when it would matter the most. When the mother, the survivor of domestic violence, has left the abuse with her child and tried to escape, she's able to be reeled back in by family court proceedings. And we have judges, guardian ad litems, directors like Iris Sunshine, judges like Judge Gordon Miller, GALs like Charlisa Powell, attorneys like Reginald Alston and Chris Beal, playing ball, being indifferent, not doing anything about it. Not only that, capitalizing upon it. Because if we continue to give these abused children and force these survivors of domestic violence to co-parent with an abuser that we know for a fact is dangerous and it could be deadly for her, we're continuing to push that narrative to profit off of it. And the fallout has already been shown. However, that's being concealed. The fallout of the domestic violence and the poor court practices of giving children to abusers and capitalizing upon the investigation and the infliction of paying child support, having to call and file the CPS reports because your child's being abused, having to be forced to pay for legal representation, and there not being any integrity anyway, so it's not really mattering. This is being capitalized upon and hidden. The death rate, the amount of domestic violence victims who have finally gotten up enough courage and strength to leave her abuser with her children in tow. She's not able to survive. She doesn't get to stay a survivor, does she? And the acquaintance and the unknown boxes are the options of the North Carolina DPS statistics versus 2001's numbers in relation to the growth of the population and the rest of the United States statistics. This is a big deal. A really big deal. So we can create conflict, hide child abuse, like create conflict, $20 million, hide child abuse, $19 million, deny domestic violence, $100 million, deny domestic violence and a child abuse post-separation, priceless. Within child homicide, murder, suicide, and domestic violence killing, the theme is, if I can't have her, nobody will. Or, I'm just going to take the thing that she loves the most so she'll suffer for forever because I have access. I can. And this is a very important point as well. To substantiate, to prove the truth of something with facts instead of opinions. By removing the team, the procedure removes oversight and additional costs. Therefore, no facts are ever substantiated. A medical exam would obviously substantiate abuse, so they aren't doing any. A disclosure of sexual abuse by a child at a forensic interview would substantiate the abuse. So children are in the custody of abuser, and there are never any reports substantiated. By not acknowledging the risks to these women and these children that they're being forced to face, and instead exploiting and capitalizing these children and mothers, those in power and those that came up with this idea and have continued to commit fraud and engage in a conspiracy, a RICO conspiracy. They are guilty of a conspiracy to commit murder. They are guilty of a conspiracy to defraud the United States government and to obstruct justice and to obstruct humanity. Finding for DSS to investigate and to keep family together or profit off of removing children from domestic violence survivors. And this is the funding that DSS actually gets. They get money to investigate and to keep the family together, or profit off of removing the children from the domestic violence survivor who is doing everything she can to protect her children, to then investigate the survivor, more money, to omit crucial protocol, more money, to ignore all abuse, more money, can't substantiate abuse, more money. Therefore, the family court can say all of the allegations are false by the safe mother because DSS says they're false. And the state law says that they have to be involved in abuse, neglect, and dependency, as well as law enforcement and the district attorney's office. And they're not either. Because remember, this is a high conflict custody battle. Don't forget that. These folks just can't get along. They can then appoint something like the Children's Law Center, the guardian ad litem, under a guise of abuse that will never be substantiated. But we're going to get the money for you saying it's abuse, or your children are actually being abused. We're going to get money for that. Even though these victims will never be safe from harm or free from abuse, and the things inflicted upon them during these proceedings and incidents will affect them for the rest of their entire life. By a child being in an abuser's care and preventing any real disclosures or substantiations, and also preventing oversight and exploit the funding by denying the use of the GAL volunteer and the medical professional, the child medical exam. They can prevent any real disclosures of substantiations. And not only that, they can keep the reports down by putting all the reports into one file, because we know there's going to be many for these children. So they just hide them. So the numbers of the reports are the same or going down in the past 18 years, right? Even though the population is increasing. But the substantiations are bottom. By not protecting domestic violence survivors and their children post-separation via family court and refusing domestic violence protective orders, when hundreds of millions of dollars of funding meant to protect them, empower them, give them stability post-separation, getting financial assistance, instead is being put in the pockets of those in power. And we know the incidents of domestic violence and death multiply when she leaves. So in order to escape from her abuser, more often than not, this is the father of her children, and she's got to go to family court. If North Carolina is refusing to acknowledge the facts when it comes to survivors and victims, then concealing facts about domestic violence homicides, they're sending domestic violence survivors and their children to their death for profit. And they know it. I don't know who knows it. Somebody does. They're re-victimizing survivors, exploiting children. Judges like Gordo, honor a man's right over a child, over a survivor's life and that child's life and that child's innocence. I'm going to leave this at that because I think I've talked about enough today. I do have a lot more to speak about, and I'll get back with you all soon. And I pray that this gets things moving a little bit faster and in the right direction for everyone, because a good state auditor would know this. And when I called the state auditor last year about domestic violence in North Carolina, things did not improve in my life. And I'm seeing a multitude of reasons why my credibility and my life was attacked. But I'm so grateful to God I'm still here and able to share this message with all of y'all. Have a good one.